The air in the grand hall of the nocturne court was always cold, a permanent chill that clung to the marble and seeped through velvet gowns. It was a coldness born of stone and of the ancient, unblinking stillness of its inhabitants. Celeste, a courtier of such minor standing, her name was little more than a whisper in the registry, felt it not in her skin but in her bones. She had been here for 3 years, a ward of a distant cousin who had fulfilled his obligation by securing her a place where she would be housed, fed, and, with any luck, forgotten. She was adept at being forgotten. She had a talent for blending into the tapestries, for becoming just another shadow in a palace built of them. Tonight was the Equinox Gala, a night of forced splendor where the vampire lords, ageless and beautiful in their predatory grace, moved among the human courtiers like wolves admiring a flock. The humans, for their part, preened and postured, offering up their wit, their beauty, their ambition, all in the desperate hope of catching an immortal eye. To be noticed was to be elevated. To be chosen was to be granted a life of exquisite luxury and terrifying permanence. Celeste wanted neither. She wanted only the quiet corner she currently occupied, a flute of chilled wine in her hand, watching the dance of power from a safe distance. From her vantage, she could see them all. Lord Valerius, his silver hair a stark slash against his black silk doublet, his smile a thin, cruel curve. He was speaking to Lady Annalise, whose laughter was a little too high, a little too brittle. Celeste watched the way Valerius's eyes tracked the frantic pulse in Annalise's throat and felt a shudder that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Then there was Lord Cassian, darker and more brooding, his gaze sweeping the room with a possessive boredom, as if he were merely taking inventory of his belongings. And on the dais, on a throne of polished obsidian that seemed to drink the light from the room, sat King Theron. He was not like the others, where they were all sharp angles and restless energy. He was stillness. A profound, unnerving stillness that suggested a power so absolute it had no need for display. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, missed nothing. Celeste had learned early on not to meet that gaze, not because she feared it in the same way she feared Valerius's smile, but because when she had, just once, she had seen something in their depths that unsettled her more than any overt threat, a weariness so ancient it felt like a geological feature, a sorrow carved into the very lines of his perfect face. She turned her attention to the periphery, where a small commotion was unfolding. A servant girl, no older than 15, had stumbled, her tray of crystal goblets crashing to the floor in a symphony of destruction. A sudden, sharp silence fell over the immediate area. The girl knelt, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the glittering shards, a tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. The supervising majordomo was bearing down on her, his face a mask of cold fury. Punishments for such clumsiness were swift and severe. Without thinking, Celeste moved. She set her flute down on a nearby ledge and glided toward the girl, her own simple gown of deep blue whispering over the marble. She knelt, her back to the majordomo, and began helping. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice a low counterpoint to the distant music. "It's just glass. It can be swept." She gently took a large, jagged piece from the girl's trembling fingers, ignoring the small sting as it sliced her palm. A single, bright bead of red welled up, a shocking spot of color in the monochrome hall. "What is the meaning of this?" The majordomo's voice was a whip crack. Celeste rose slowly, keeping her body between him and the terrified girl. She held up her bleeding hand, not as a plea, but as a simple fact. "An accident, Master Hemlock. One I have contributed to. The fault is mine." She was lying, of course, but a demerit against her name was a feather against the lead weight of what would befall the servant. Hemlock's lip curled. A courtier does not kneel in the dirt for a clumsy whelp. "You forget your station, Lady Celeste." The name, spoken aloud, felt like a betrayal. She had worked so hard to make it insignificant. Before she could reply, another voice, smooth as chilled honey but carrying the menace of a drawn blade, cut through the air. "On the contrary," Lord Valerius said, appearing as if from the shadows themselves. He was closer than she'd realized. His eyes were not on the majordomo, but on the drop of blood on her palm. "It seems the lady has a tender heart. A rare commodity in this court." His gaze lifted to her face, and for the first time, Celeste felt the full, undivided attention of an elder. It was not a pleasant sensation. It felt like being pinned by a needle, examined under glass. The air grew thick, heavy. She could feel the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. The dozens of eyes that now turned to her. This nobody, this shadow who had suddenly been thrown into the stark, unforgiving light. Lord Cassian materialized at Valerius's side, a matched set of predators. Indeed, Cassian murmured, his eyes lingering on her face with an appraising intensity. Compassion. How quaint. Celeste's heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She wanted to shrink back into the shadows, to become invisible again. But she was trapped in their dual gaze. The servant girl had already been forgotten, scurrying away while the larger beasts were distracted. But Celeste was left in her place, the offering. Across the hall, she risked a glance at the throne. King Theron had not moved. His hand still rested on the arms of his obsidian chair, but his eyes were on her. The weariness was gone, replaced by an expression of sharp, cold assessment. It offered no comfort. In that moment, she understood. She had done more than break a glass or defend a servant. She had made herself noticed. To be noticed was to be hunted. The blood on her hand suddenly felt like a beacon, and she, the foolish lost ship, being drawn toward the rocks. The days that followed were a masterclass in subtle terror. It began with gifts. The morning after the gala, a single perfect black rose was delivered to her chambers. There was no card, but she knew. Its petals were like velvet, its thorns unnervingly sharp. The next day, it was a book of sonnets bound in soft leather, its pages filled with passionate, possessive verse. That one, she suspected, was from Cassian, whose brooding nature suggested a taste for tortured poetry. Then came a bolt of silk from Valerius, the color of a midnight sky, so fine it felt like water in her hands. They were beautiful things a courtier of her station could never dream of owning. They were also chains, each one a link in a cage they were building around her. She could not refuse them. To do so would be a mortal insult. So she accepted them with a numb, polite nod to the royal couriers, then hid them away in a chest at the foot of her bed, as if breaking line of sight could somehow negate their meaning. The lords themselves were a constant, oppressive presence. They did not approach her directly in the crowded halls. Not yet. Instead, they watched. She would be taking her meager lunch in the courtyard, and she would feel a prickling on her neck, turning to see Valerius leaning against a far colonnade, his silver hair catching the pale sun, his eyes fixed on her. She would be reading in the library's quiet alcoves, and a shadow would fall over her page. Looking up, she would find Cassian standing at the end of the aisle, partially obscured by a bookshelf, observing her with an unnerving stillness. They were circling, a patient, predatory dance that everyone at court could see. Her life, once blessedly anonymous, was now the subject of endless speculation. Whispers followed her down corridors. Ladies who had never given her a second glance now watched her with a mixture of envy and pity. Valerius and Cassian, she heard one woman murmur to another as she passed. The girl must have some potent hidden charm. Another sneered. Or she's simply fresh meat. They tire of their toys so quickly. Celeste learned the true meaning of loneliness. Her few acquaintances, other low-ranking courtiers, began to avoid her, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. To be near her was to risk being caught in the blast when the lords' rivalry finally ignited. She ate alone, walked alone, and spent her nights in her small chamber. Sleepless, starting at every creak of the floorboards in the hall. The fear was a living thing inside her, a cold knot in her stomach that never unwound. She began to understand the nature of the prize for which they competed. It was not her hand in marriage, not in the human sense. They vied for the right to bestow the sanguine covenant, the blood bond. It was spoken of in reverent, romanticized tones at court, a sacrament, an eternal joining of souls. But Celeste had seen the bonded women. She had seen Lady Alara, Valerius's last prize, a stunning beauty who now moved through the court with a serene, empty grace. Her eyes held a placid sweetness that was deeply unsettling. She never spoke unless spoken to, and her entire being seemed to revolve around her lord. A perfect, beautiful satellite. Celeste had once thought it was devotion. Now she feared it was something far more sinister. An erasure. One evening, desperate for a moment of peace, she slipped into the royal gardens, a place usually reserved for the highest echelons of the court. The moon was high and full, bathing the manicured hedges and pale roses in an ethereal silver light. She found a stone bench hidden within an alcove of jasmine. The sweet scent, a balm to her frayed nerves. She closed her eyes, just for a second, trying to remember what it felt like to not be afraid. You should not be here. The voice was low, calm, and came from so close behind her she gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around. It was King Theron. He was not wearing his crown or his formal regalia, but a simple, dark tunic and trousers. Without the trappings of his office, he looked younger, though the ancient weight in his eyes remained. He stood in the shadows of a cypress tree, and she had the sense he had been there for some time, watching her. "Your Majesty," she stammered, sinking into a clumsy curtsy. "Forgive me. I did not know. I will leave at once." "Stay," he commanded. It was not a harsh command, but it held an undeniable authority. He stepped out of the shadows, the moonlight catching the severe lines of his face. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering fountains. "This garden is one of the few places in this palace where one can find a measure of silence. I am not inclined to give it up, nor should you be." They stood in an awkward, charged silence, the only sounds the gentle splash of water and the frantic beating of Celeste's own heart. She did not know the protocol for this. She was a mouse caught in the presence of a dragon. "They are hunting you," he said finally, his voice devoid of inflection. It was a simple statement of fact. The bluntness of it stole her breath. I have done nothing to invite it, Your Majesty." "You were kind," he replied, still not looking at her. "In a place where kindness is a currency more rare and more dangerous than gold. You showed them a part of yourself they believed no longer existed, and like all collectors they now wish to possess it." He paused, and a flicker of something frustration, perhaps, crossed his features. "They are old, Lady Celeste, old and bored. They mistake novelty for substance." A desperate, foolish hope sparked within her. He was the king. He could stop this. He could command them to leave her be. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Is there nothing to be done? Could you not send me away? To a convent, perhaps? Or a distant estate? Somewhere they would not think to look?" At this, he finally turned to look at her. His stormy eyes met hers, and the hope she'd felt withered under the cold, hard reality she saw there. "The ancient laws forbid a king from banishing or relocating any courtier without elder council approval," he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed anger. "It was a safeguard my own ancestors put in place against tyranny, and now it binds me as surely as iron chains. To request your removal would require revealing my reasons to the council. They would demand to know why a king concerns himself with the fate of a minor courtier. And the moment they suspected I was protecting you from elder suitors, they would never approve. They would see through it immediately, and worse, their curiosity would be piqued. You would become even more valuable. A forbidden prize the king himself tried to hide." He looked away again, his jaw clenched. "I could send you in secret, but Valerius and Cassian are not fools. They have eyes everywhere. The moment you disappeared, they would know it was my doing. They would hunt you to the ends of the earth, not for love of you, but to defy me. It would become a challenge to their pride, a test of their power against mine." He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw. "The Sanguine Covenant is an ancient right, protected by laws I did not write, and traditions I cannot break, without shattering the peace of this kingdom. Valerius and Cassian are not merely lords. They are the heads of the two largest vampire bloodlines in the realm. Each commands the loyalty of hundreds of kin. To move against them directly, to order them to cease their pursuit or to make you disappear under my protection, would be seen as an act of tyranny by the Elder Council. It would mean civil war, a fracturing of the kingdom that would cost thousands of lives, mortal and immortal alike." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And even if I were willing to commit such an act, the elder bloodlines are protected by ancient blood oaths, woven into the very founding of this kingdom. Any vampire who kills another of elder rank triggers a magical binding that reveals the killer's identity to all of their kin. There are no secret assassinations among our kind. No convenient accidents. To kill Valerius or Cassian would be to sign a declaration of war in my own blood, a war I would fight alone against hundreds of their enraged relatives. The kingdom would burn, and you would still be hunted not by two lords, but by their entire bloodlines seeking vengeance. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders rigid with the weight of his powerlessness. My power is absolute in many things. In this I am bound as tightly as any servant. The finality in his tone was like a death sentence. He was telling her he could not help her. Or would not. He was the king, and she was a pawn in a game whose rules were written in blood long before she was born. I see, she whispered, the words tasting of ash. The last ember of hope died, leaving her colder than she had ever been. No, he said, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. You don't. He took a step toward her, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he might reach for her. But he stopped, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The moonlight illuminated the stark agony in his face, an expression of such profound conflict that it stunned her. It was the look of a man trapped in a cage of his own making. Be careful, Lady Celeste, he said, his voice a raw whisper. The court is a treacherous place. Make yourself small, make yourself forgettable. It is your only defense. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he was gone, melting back into the shadows, leaving her alone with the scent of jasmine and the chilling certainty that she was utterly, hopelessly, on her own. The king had given her advice, but he had offered no salvation. He had only confirmed the nature of her prison. The hunt escalated. The lords, sensing a rival, abandoned their subtlety. Their courtship became a siege. Now they would approach her in the halls, their presence sucking all the air from the space around her. Valerius would corner her in the tapestry gallery, his voice a silken murmur as he described the eternal, sunless gardens of his ancestral estate, a place she could one day see as its mistress. He would let his fingers brush her arm, a touch that felt like a brand, leaving her skin feeling both cold and burned. Cassian, in turn, would find her near the minstrel's dais, speaking of loyalty and devotion, of a bond that transcended mortal feeling. His dark eyes would bore into hers, attempting to plunder her thoughts, to find the key to her surrender. Their competition grew more overt, more dangerous. They began to clash in her presence, their ancient enmity flaring over the prize they both coveted. One afternoon, as Celeste was leaving the scriptorium, she found them both waiting for her in the corridor, blocking her path. Lady Celeste, Valerius began, stepping forward with a predatory smile. I was just telling Lord Cassian that the pale shades of the library do not do your complexion justice. You belong in the sun. The sun burns, Cassian countered, his voice a low rumble. She requires the cool, steady light of the moon, a light I can provide. You would see her fade into the shadows as you have, Valerius sneered. I would see her illuminated. They were not speaking to her, but at each other, using her as the battlefield. Celeste stood frozen between them, a sparrow between two circling hawks. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She felt the eyes of other courtiers on them, the way people flattened themselves against the walls to give the impending conflict a wide berth. My lords, she finally managed, her voice a thin thread. You honor me, but I must. I have duties to attend to. It was a feeble attempt at escape, and they both knew it. Valerius's smile widened. Your only duty, my dear, is to choose. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. A choice between two different kinds of annihilation. Before she could formulate another desperate excuse, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the tension. Lord Valerius, Lord Cassian. King Theron stood at the end of the hall. He had not raised his voice, yet it carried with an unmistakable weight that silenced the corridor. The two lords turned, their expressions shifting from predatory rivalry to a guarded deference. Your Majesty, they said in unison, bowing their heads. Theron's gaze was like ice. He did not look at Celeste, focusing entirely on the two lords. I find it curious, he said, his voice dangerously soft, that two of the most senior members of my court have so much time to squander in idle pursuits. There are matters of state that require your attention. Valerius, the trade ledgers from the southern provinces are unaudited. Cassian, the reports from the western garrisons are overdue. I trust you will both find a more productive use for your afternoon. It was a clear, public dismissal, a rebuke. The two lords exchanged a dark look, their jaws tight with barely concealed fury. but they could not disobey a direct command from the king. With another curt bow, they turned and departed in opposite directions, their anger a palpable wave in their wake. The corridor slowly returned to life, people resuming their business, though their whispers were now about the king's unexpected intervention. Celeste was left standing alone, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of terror and a fragile, disbelieving relief. Theron's eyes finally fell upon her. The cold authority in them softened, just for an instant, replaced by that same, deep-seated weariness she had seen before. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that accomplished nothing and everything at once. Then he, too, turned and walked away, his solitary figure receding down the long marbled hall. She understood what he had done. He had bought her time, a brief reprieve. But he had not solved the problem, he had merely postponed it. In publicly chastising two powerful elders, he had raised the stakes. He had inadvertently made her more valuable, her symbolic worth now tied to the pride of two ancient lords and the authority of the king himself. His intervention was not a shield. It was a spotlight, and it was now fixed, directly, blindingly, upon her. The cage was still there, its door still shut, and the king had just reminded the keepers of the value of the bird inside. The night of the celestial mask arrived, marking the apex of the social season. It was an evening of extravagant artifice, where everyone from the highest lord to the lowliest page hid behind a mask of painted silk or jeweled lacquer. But Celeste knew there was no mask that could hide her. The lord's interest had become a suffocating obsession, and the court buzzed with the unspoken question of which of them would finally make his claim. She had spent the week in a state of quiet dread, moving through her days like a ghost, the king's intervention having bought her nothing but a more intense, more focused scrutiny. She had tried to make herself small, as he'd advised, but it was like trying to hide a candle in a dark room. Its light only seemed brighter for the effort. She chose a simple mask of dark blue feathers, one that obscured the upper half of her face but did little to conceal her identity. Her gown was the same deep blue, a color she hoped would allow her to melt into the twilight hues of the ballroom. But the moment she entered, she felt their eyes on her. Valerius, behind the guise of a silver wolf, watched her from across the dance floor. Cassian, a stoic raven in black jet, stood near the orchestra, his gaze a physical weight. They were not even pretending to engage with other guests. They were waiting for her. The evening wore on, a torturous slow-motion ballet of avoidance. Celeste kept to the edges of the room, accepting a glass of wine she didn't drink, making small, meaningless talk with the few who dared approach her. Every step was calculated, every glance over her shoulder a confirmation of the inevitable. She felt like a fox, hearing the baying of the hounds growing ever closer. Then, the music swelled for the midnight waltz, the most significant dance of the evening. It was tradition for major announcements, betrothals, alliances, and claims to be made just after. This was the moment she had been dreading. As if on cue, both Valerius and Cassian began to move, converging on her position from opposite sides of the room. Their intent was unmistakable. They would force the issue here, now, in front of the entire court. Panic, stark and absolute, flooded her. She looked around wildly for an escape, but she was hemmed in by the press of the crowd. Her eyes darted to the dais, searching for the king. Theron sat on his throne, his mask a simple, unadorned piece of black iron that seemed more a part of his face than a disguise. He was watching the scene unfold, his posture rigid, his hands gripping the arms of his throne so tightly his knuckles were white. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the glittering expanse, and in his gaze she saw a terrifying resolve. It was not the look of a rescuer. It was the look of a man about to burn down a forest to save a single tree. Just as Valerius reached out a gloved hand toward her, Theron rose. A hush fell over the hall. The music faltered and died. Every masked face turned toward the throne. Before the waltz begins, the king's voice rang out, clear and cold as a winter bell. I have an observation to make. He descended the steps of the dais, moving with a deliberate, lethal grace. He did not stop until he was standing in the center of the floor, just feet from where Celeste stood frozen between her two pursuers. He slowly surveyed the room, his iron mask making his expression unreadable. But his intent radiated from him like a killing frost. We are a court of tradition, of lineage, of worth, he began, his voice deceptively calm. We measure ourselves by the purity of our blood, the strength of our alliances, the quality of that which we choose to elevate. Our choices define us. His gaze swept over Valerius and Cassian, a silent, pointed condemnation. Then, his eyes, and the eyes of the entire court, fell on Celeste. She wanted to die. She wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow her whole. And so I find myself perplexed, Theron continued, his voice dripping with a carefully crafted disdain. He took a step closer to her, circling her as a wolf might circle a lamb. I see two of the oldest and most powerful houses in my kingdom vying for this. He gestured toward her with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of utter dismissal. Celeste flinched as if struck. A collective gasp rippled through the room. This girl, Theron said, his voice rising, each word a precisely aimed dart. A courtier of no name, no notable lineage. A ward of a minor house from the farthest, most forgettable corner of the kingdom. Possessing no particular wit, no remarkable beauty, no dowry of any consequence. He stopped in front of her. So close, she could see the faint tracery of lines around his eyes behind the mask. He looked down at her, and his voice dropped to a tone of scathing public pity. She is adequate, a harmless, simple creature, suitable, perhaps, as a companion for a lesser knight or a merchant's second son. Every word was a physical blow. Celeste's blood ran cold, then hot with a shame so profound it threatened to suffocate her. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, feel their judgment, their scorn, their morbid fascination. She was no longer a person. She was an object, being publicly dissected and found wanting. And yet, Theron's voice boomed, turning his fury back on the two lords. My most esteemed elders compete for her as if she were the prize of the century. What does this say of you, my lords? That your standards have fallen so low? That your boredom has led you to find amusement in polishing a common river stone and pretending it is a diamond? He laughed, a short, ugly sound entirely devoid of humor. You embarrass yourselves. You embarrass this court. You insult the very tradition you claim to uphold by placing value where there is none. He turned his back on her then, a final, damning gesture. Find a prize worthy of your station, he commanded, his voice ringing with the unassailable power of the throne. This one is beneath you. She is beneath notice. She is worthless. The final word hung in the dead silence of the hall. Worthless. It echoed in the vast space, multiplied by the shocked stillness of the crowd. It burrowed into Celeste's heart, a poisoned seed taking root. She could not breathe. The edges of her vision blurred. She saw Valerius and Cassian, their postures stiff with humiliation and rage. Not at her, but at the king who had so thoroughly unmanned them. She saw the masked faces of the court, their expressions a mixture of shock, cruel amusement, and pity. The king had not saved her. He had annihilated her. He had taken her name, her dignity, her very sense of self, and ground it into dust on the ballroom floor. He hadn't just shielded her from the lords, he had made her so foul, so untouchable, that no one would ever look at her again without hearing the king's pronouncement, worthless. The music started up again, a jarring, cheerful melody that felt like a scream. The world swam back into focus. Celeste turned, her body moving with a strange, disconnected autonomy, and fled. She did not run, she walked, her back straight, her head held high, a final futile act of defiance against the wave of shame that threatened to drown her. She walked through the parting sea of courtiers, their whispers like the hissing of snakes, and did not stop until she was out of the ballroom, out of the light, and alone in the cold, dark hall, where she finally leaned against the stone wall and shattered. The walk back to her chambers was a journey through a nightmare. The whispers were real now, no longer confined to speculation. They were sharp, pointed, and cruel. Worthless, she heard from a shadowed alcove. The king himself said it. Faces turned away as she approached. Doors that had once been open to her were now closed. In the space of 10 minutes, she had become a ghost, a cautionary tale, a social leper. King Theron had not merely destroyed her reputation, he had erased her. In the days that followed, a minor lord from the eastern provinces, newly arrived at court and eager to make his mark, quietly inquired among his peers whether the girl might now be available, her price lowered by the king's scorn. The response was immediate and brutal. To pursue her now, an older courtier had sneered, would be to announce to the entire realm that your standards are so low, even refuse appeals to you. You would be a laughingstock. The king has made her untouchable, not as a prize, but as a cautionary tale. The young lord never spoke of her again. She reached her room and locked the door. The sound of the bolt sliding home, a final, definitive severing. She leaned against the wood, her whole body trembling with the aftershocks of the humiliation. She tore the feathered mask from her face and hurled it across the room, where it struck the wall with a pathetic, soundless flutter. She did not cry. The pain was too deep for tears, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The king's words played over and over in her mind, a relentless litany of her inadequacy. No name, no wit, no beauty. Simple. Worthless. He had stripped her bare in front of the entire world. And for what? To prove a point to his bickering lords? To assert his dominance? She had been nothing more than a tool, a means to an end, and now that her purpose was served, she had been discarded. The brief, fleeting moments of connection she'd imagined, the shared silence in the garden, the flicker of understanding in his eyes, were revealed as a foolish, desperate fantasy. He was no different from the others. He was just more powerful, and therefore, more cruel. Sometime before dawn, the trembling stopped, replaced by a hollow, crystalline clarity. There was nothing left for her here. To stay would be to endure 1,000 tiny deaths every day, to live forever in the shadow of her public disgrace. Her life at court was over. She moved with a quiet, desperate efficiency. She had little to pack. She took a simple woolen traveling cloak, a spare dress, and the small pouch of coins she had saved over 3 years, a pittance, but enough to get her away from this city. She looked at the chest at the foot of her bed, the one containing the Lord's unwanted gifts. With a surge of bitter defiance, she opened it, took out the bolt of midnight silk, and tore a long strip from it, which she used to bundle her meager belongings. The rest, the poetry, the rose, now dried and brittle, she left behind. Let them rot. She scribbled a short, formal note to her cousin, thanking him for his care and releasing him from any further obligation. She did not say where she was going, because she did not know. Her only destination was away. Dressed in her cloak, her small bundle clutched in her hand, she slipped out of her room. The castle was in the deep, quiet slumber that precedes the dawn. She moved through the familiar corridors, now alien and hostile, a shadow flitting through the heart of the beast that had devoured her. She did not look back. The journey was a blur of muddy roads and gray skies. She traveled for weeks, selling a small silver locket her mother had given her for food and passage on a farmer's cart heading south. The farther she got from the capital, the more the cold stone in her chest began to thaw, replaced by a raw, aching grief. She grieved for the naive girl who had thought she could be invisible, for the life that had been stolen from her, for the dignity that had been so casually annihilated. She eventually found herself in a small, remote village nestled in a river valley, a place called Stillwater. So far from the capital it felt like another world. The air was clean, the people were plain-spoken, and no one cared about court politics or the whims of immortal lords. Here, she was just Celeste, a quiet young woman with sad eyes and a willingness to work. She had briefly considered taking a different name entirely, becoming someone new in truth as well as in circumstance. But Celeste was common enough in the southern provinces. She had met 3 others in her travels alone. More than that, it was the only piece of herself she had left, the only thread connecting her to the girl her mother had named, before courts and cruelty had tried to unmake her. She kept it close like a talisman, a whispered promise that she was still, somehow, herself. She found lodging with the village healer, an old woman named Elspeth, whose back was bent but whose mind was sharp as a needle. Celeste began as an assistant, cleaning and chopping herbs, grinding poultices, and sitting with the sick. She discovered she had a knack for it. The quiet, methodical work of mending soothed the ragged edges of her own soul. There was a simple, honest truth in healing that had been absent from every moment of her life at court. A fever was a fever. A broken bone was a broken bone. They were problems to be solved, not games to be played. 15 years passed. The seasons turned and the sharp wound of her past slowly scarred over. The girl who had fled the capital was gone, replaced by a woman. Celeste was no longer a frightened courtier but a respected healer. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now stained with herbs and calloused from work. The years had left their mark on her face, as well faint lines around her eyes, a certain weathering that came from grief and hard labor. Her hair, which she now wore in a simple braid, had lost some of its youthful luster. She looked older than her 31 years, aged by sorrow and toil. She learned the language of plants, the rhythms of sickness and health. She learned to listen, not to whispers in corridors, but to the stories of pain and hope in the hearts of the people she treated. She rarely thought of the nocturne court, and when she did, it was like a half-remembered nightmare, distant and unreal. She had built a new life, a small, quiet, and meaningful one. She had taken the broken pieces of herself and fashioned them into something whole, something useful. She was no longer worthless. She was necessary. The news arrived as it always did, with traveling merchants from the north. They spoke of a sickness in the capital, a virulent fever they called the Grey Veil for the pale, deathly pallor it gave its victims. It had started in the crowded lower districts but had soon spread, respecting neither wealth nor station. The great city of Illyria was gripped by fear. The disease afflicted mortals primarily, though vampires could serve as carriers, spreading it unknowingly through their households and courts. At first, Celeste paid it little mind. The capital was a world away. But as the months wore on, the news grew grimmer. The fever was spreading, moving down the trade routes like a creeping fog. Local remedies were useless against it. The royal physicians were overwhelmed. Then came the decree, posted in the square of every town and village. By order of King Theron, all persons with demonstrable healing skill were summoned to the capital. Their travel would be paid for, their service handsomely rewarded, and a full royal pardon would be granted for any past crimes or transgressions. The decree noted that the Elder Council had granted the king emergency powers in light of the crisis, powers that came at great political cost but were necessary to save the kingdom. The traveling merchants spoke in hushed tones of the price the king had paid for those powers. Expanded mining rights granted to House Valerius, allowing them to dig deeper into the southern mountains. Increased territorial control for House Cassian's western garrisons, and, most significantly, a binding royal oath not to challenge the Sanguine Covenant or any elder marriage rights for a period of 20 years. It was a devil's bargain, trading future reform for present survival, and the king had taken it without hesitation to save his people. The king was mobilizing an army of healers to fight a war against a plague. Elspeth, now frail and housebound, read the decree with Celeste. "They are desperate," the old woman wheezed, her breath rattling in her chest. "Let them be," Celeste said, her voice hard. "They are nothing to me." The thought of returning to that city, to those stone halls, sent a shard of ice through her veins. "You are the best healer in this valley," Elspeth said, her faded eyes sharp. "You've a gift for it. A calling. A calling does not care for geography, my girl. It does not care for old wounds." Celeste fought against it for days. The capital was the site of her greatest trauma, the source of a pain she had worked so hard to overcome. To return felt like a surrender, a reopening of a wound she had believed closed. But every night, she dreamed of fevered faces, of people dying while she stood by, clinging to her own hurt. Her identity as a healer was now more fundamental to her than her identity as a wronged courtier. Could she truly turn her back when so many were suffering? The king's decree offered a pardon, an ironic, bitter little gift. She needed no pardon for fleeing a life that was destroying her. But the summons was not from the king, not really. It was from the sick. It was from the dying. It was from the part of herself she had painstakingly rebuilt. With a heavy heart, she made her decision. She packed her herbs, her medical texts, and a few simple clothes into a satchel. She said her goodbyes to Elspeth, promising to return, a promise they both knew she might not be able to keep. The journey back to Illyria was surreal. She traveled with a caravan of other healers, apothecaries, midwives, hedge witches, all answering the king's call. The city she returned to was not the one she had fled. The glittering, arrogant capital was gone, replaced by a city muted by fear. The streets were quieter, the faces of the people pinched and pale. Carts carrying the dead, covered in gray shrouds, rumbled down the cobblestones. The air smelled of wood smoke and medicinal incense, a constant battle against the stench of sickness. She was registered at a central infirmary, her skills quickly assessed and her identity barely glanced at. She gave her name simply as Celeste of Stillwater, and the harried clerk wrote it down without a second thought. She was no longer Lady Celeste of a forgotten house. She was Healer Celeste of Stillwater, and that was all that mattered. Due to her evident expertise, she was assigned to the noble courtier, where the fever was now raging unchecked. She worked tirelessly, falling into a routine of exhaustion and duty. Days and nights blurred into a series of fevered brows, whispered last words, and the small, quiet victories of a fever breaking or a breath easing. She was too busy, too focused, to think about her past. She moved through the great, cold houses of the nobility. A humble figure in a practical dress, her hair now streaked with premature gray and hidden beneath a simple headscarf, her satchel of herbs her only authority. The lords and ladies who would have once looked through her now looked at her with desperate, pleading eyes. The plague was the great equalizer. One evening, a royal messenger, his face grim, arrived at the small clinic where she rested. "Healer Celeste?" he asked. She nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "You are summoned to the estate of Lord Valerius. Urgently." The name was a jolt, a key turning in a long-locked door. Valerius. She had not thought of him in years. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, washed over her. But she was a healer. She could not refuse the call. The Valerius estate was as opulent and chilling as she remembered from court gossip. She was led through silent, cavernous halls to the master chambers. Lord Valerius met her at the door. He had not changed. The same immortal, predatory beauty, the same silver hair. But today, his perfect face was etched with a rare human anxiety. He looked at her face, his silver eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place a half-remembered dream. "You seem familiar," he said slowly. "Were you at court once? Many years ago, perhaps?" But even as he spoke, he was dismissing the notion. The girl from the mask had been young, soft, unmarked by life, a useless, pretty thing with smooth hands and frightened eyes. This woman before him was weathered, her face lined with care and exhaustion, her hair streaked with premature gray and hidden beneath a practical headscarf, her hands rough and stained with the evidence of hard labor. They could not possibly be the same person. 15 years was nothing to him, but it was clearly a lifetime to mortals. Celeste kept her face carefully neutral, her voice steady. "I was a very minor courtier, my lord. Briefly. A long time ago, you would have no reason to remember me." She let the implication hang. She had been beneath his notice then, as the king had so publicly declared. Valerius frowned, then shook his head as if dismissing a troublesome thought. "Ah well, it matters not. All mortal faces blur together eventually. It is my Lady Alara, the physicians can do nothing." He led her into the room. Lady Alara lay in a vast canopied bed. She had the gray veil. That much was obvious from her shallow breathing and the sheen of sweat on her pale skin. But as Celeste drew closer, she saw it was more than that. The woman she remembered from court, a vibrant, laughing beauty, was gone. This Alara was a fragile, hollowed-out thing. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, stared at the canopy above, and a soft, tuneless humming came from her lips, a repetitive, mindless sound. Celeste began her examination. As she gently felt for the fever in Alara's neck, her fingers brushed against a series of faint, silvery scars, almost invisible against the pale skin, arranged in a delicate crescent pattern. She froze. The mark of the sanguine covenant. She worked through the night, administering tinctures to fight the fever, cooling Alara's brow. Valerius never left the room, pacing like a caged panther. But his concern felt off. It was not the grief of a husband for his wife. It was the frustration of a collector whose most prized possession is inexplicably broken. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Alara's breathing eased, and she fell into a true, deep sleep. Valerius gave a curt nod of thanks and all but dismissed Celeste. As she was packing her satchel, an elderly serving woman, who had been silently assisting her all night, touched her arm. "Thank you," the old woman whispered, her eyes full of a profound sadness. "You have eased her body, but her mind has been gone for a long, long time." Celeste looked at the servant, then at the sleeping woman in the bed. "The covenant?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. "He claimed her. 15 years ago. Just after. Well, just after all that ugliness at the mask. She was the most sought-after lady at court. He won her. At first, it was, as the stories say. She was devoted, happy. But the bond, it doesn't just ensure loyalty. It drinks the soul. Slowly. It takes their memories, their will, their very self, until all that is left is a beautiful, obedient shell that lives only to please its master. She wrung her hands. He loves what she is now, perfect, unchanging. His. But the woman she was. He has erased her. Celeste felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to tilt. She looked at the faint, silvery scars on Alara's neck. And then she thought of the other women from that time. The other prizes. She thought of Cassian's choice, a fiery, witty baroness who was now never seen in public. It all crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow, the empty eyes, the serene, placid expressions. The mindless devotion. It wasn't love, it was annihilation. A living death. And in that moment of sickening, horrifying clarity, she understood. King Theron's words from the ballroom echoed in her head. Worthless. Simple. Beneath notice. It had not been an act of cruelty. It had been a rescue. He hadn't been destroying her. He had been building her a shield out of the most powerful materials he had. Shame and scorn. He had made her so undesirable, so publicly reviled, that no lord would ever claim her. He couldn't save her honor, so he had sacrificed it to save her soul. The crushing weight of her humiliation, the burden she had carried for 15 years, suddenly reconfigured itself into the most profound, desperate, and agonizing act of protection she could possibly imagine. She stumbled out of the Valerius estate and into the gray dawn, her entire world remade. She had not been discarded. She had been saved. The call came 3 days later. The gray veil had breached the palace walls. The king's own household staff were falling ill, and the royal physicians, depleted and exhausted, were losing the battle. Healer Celeste of Stillwater, whose success in the noble courtier had become the subject of hopeful rumor, was summoned to the royal palace itself. Walking through those gates for the first time in 15 years was like stepping into a half-forgotten dream. The palace was both the same and utterly different. The cold marble, the soaring arches, the oppressive opulence, it was all as she remembered. But the fear that had once been hers alone now permeated the very stone. The halls were mostly empty, the usual throngs of courtiers and petitioners gone. The few people she saw moved with a grim purpose, their faces hidden behind cloth masks scented with herbs. The heart of the kingdom was under siege from within. She was led not to the grand throne room or the formal receiving chambers, but to the king's private wing, a part of the palace she had never seen. The guards at the door, their faces stoic behind their steel helmets, simply nodded her through. She found him in his study. The room was vast, lined from floor to ceiling with books. A fire crackled in a large hearth, casting flickering shadows across the shelves. And in the center of it all, standing before a large table, covered in maps and charts, was King Theron. He was not wearing his crown. Like in the garden all those years ago, he was dressed in a simple black tunic. He looked tired. The centuries of weariness she had once glimpsed in his eyes were now carved into his face, stark and undeniable. He had not slept. He had been fighting this war on all fronts, and it was taking its toll. He turned as she entered, and his stormy eyes met hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air crackled with the weight of 15 years of silence, of pain, of misunderstanding. He saw not the frightened girl in a borrowed gown, but a woman, her face calmer, stronger, marked by time and hardship, her healer's hands stained with her trade. And she saw not the cruel, distant monarch who had destroyed her, but the man whose terrible sacrifice had given her the life she now lived. "Healer," he said finally, his voice a low rasp. It was not a title, but a statement of fact, of acknowledgement. "Your Majesty," she replied, her voice steady. She did not curtsy. They were beyond such formalities now. "They say you have a gift," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "That you have turned the tide in the courtier. I have some skill with herbs," she said simply. "And I am not afraid of the sick." Silence descended again, thicker this time. It was a silence filled with everything that had never been said. He took a half step toward her, then stopped. as if held by an invisible chain. "Why did you come back, Celeste?" he asked, his voice raw. "To this city? To this place that treated you so cruelly?" She held his gaze. And the answer that rose in her was the truest thing she had ever known. She had been preparing her confrontation for 3 days, imagining the anger, the questions, the accusations. But seeing him now, seeing the profound loneliness that clung to him like a shroud, all of it melted away, leaving only a single, vital question. "I went to the Valerius estate," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. "I treated Lady Alara." She paused, letting the name hang in the air between them. "Tell me, Your Majesty, is she happy?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. A tremor went through his powerful frame. The carefully constructed mask of the king, the one he had worn for centuries, shattered. He turned away from her, bracing his hands on the map-covered table, as if he could no longer support his own weight. His shoulders slumped. "Happy?" he repeated, the word a shard of glass in his throat. "She is content. She feels no pain, no fear, no sorrow." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection of the polished wood of the table. "She also feels no joy, no love, no hope. She is a beautiful, flawless music box that plays the same sad tune over and over. Valerius has his perfect prize. And she has nothing. She is nothing." The confession, so stark and brutal, was all the confirmation she needed. But it wasn't enough. She had to hear it all. "Why?" she whispered, taking a step closer. "Why me? Why did you do it?" He straightened up slowly, turning to face her fully. The agony on his face was terrible to behold. It was the face of a man who had carried an impossible burden, alone, for a very long time. "Because I saw you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "From the first day you arrived at court. You were quiet, you were unassuming, but you were not empty. I watched you. I saw the way you looked at the art, not to be seen looking, but because the colors moved you. I saw the way you were kind to the servants, not for reward, but because it was your nature. In a court full of polished stone, you were a wildflower growing in a crack in the marble. You had a spirit, a light, that I had not seen in 100 years. He took a step toward her, his hands still clenched at his sides. "And I saw them see it too. Valerius. Cassian. I knew what they wanted. Not to cherish that light, but to capture it. To own it. To put it in a cage until it went out. The covenant would not have just bound you, Celeste. It would have extinguished you. I could not let that happen." Tears she hadn't known she possessed welled in her eyes. "You could have sent me away," she choked out. "You could have—" "I tried," he interrupted, his voice breaking. "God help me, I tried everything within my power. But the laws bound me. To openly protect you would have made you more valuable, more hunted. To send you away in secret would have triggered their pursuit, and they would have seen it as a challenge to their pride, to my authority. They would have torn the kingdom apart looking for you, not because they loved you, but to prove they could defy me." His hands trembled. "I could not make you safe by protecting you. I could only make you safe by making you worthless. I had to destroy the very thing I loved to save it." He stood before her, stripped of his kingship, his power, his pride. He was just a man, confessing the terrible calculus of his choice. He had chosen her freedom over his own peace, her soul over his own conscience. "That night in the garden," he whispered, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "I wanted to tell you. I wanted to warn you, to explain, to beg your forgiveness in advance for what I was about to do. But I couldn't risk it. If they suspected my interest, if anyone guessed that I cared for you, it would have been 1,000 times worse. So I gave you useless advice and walked away. It was the hardest thing I had ever done." He paused, his breath catching. "Until the mask. To stand there and say those words to you, to watch the light in your eyes die. It was a wound. One that has never healed." He finally closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "I did it," he said, his voice now just a whisper in the silent room. "Because I had already, foolishly, allowed myself to love you, and it was the only act of love I had to give. I sent agents to find you afterward, to ensure you were alive, That you had survived what I had done to you, but you had vanished so completely. You changed your name, perhaps, or simply disappeared into the vastness of the kingdom. My best spies found nothing. For 15 years I did not know if you lived or died, if you had found peace or if my cruelty had destroyed you utterly. A tear traced down his cheek. When your name appeared on the healer registries, I had to read it 3 times to believe it was truly you. That you had not just survived, but had become someone extraordinary, someone who saves lives instead of attending pointless galas. It was the first moment of peace I had known in 15 years. And even had I found you, what letter could I have sent? The court has eyes everywhere, in every messenger's satchel, every courier's route. To write to you would have been to reveal that you mattered to me, to make you a target once more. Any explanation, any apology, any confession would have been intercepted and used as a weapon. I could only pray. Though I have no right to pray that somehow, someday, you would understand what I had done, and why. The confession hung in the air, a fragile, shimmering thing. Celeste felt the last of her old anger, the last of her remembered pain, dissolve into a wave of profound, aching understanding. The stone she had carried in her chest for 15 years was finally, utterly gone, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire being. The years of loneliness, of struggle, of rebuilding her life, brick by painful brick, all of it was recontextualized, not as a punishment, but as a gift. A terrible, necessary, and agonizingly precious gift. She saw him. Not the king, not her destroyer, not her savior, but the man who had borne the weight of his terrible choice in silence. The centuries of solitude she had glimpsed in his eyes were now laid bare. He had been as much a prisoner of his crown as she had been of the court. Without thinking, she raised her hand and gently, tentatively, laid it on his arm. His skin was cool, but a tremor ran through him at her touch, a current of shock and relief. It was the first time they had ever touched. It felt less like a gesture, and more like the closing of a circuit. A connection forged across a chasm of years and pain. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up to her face, his stormy eyes full of a vulnerability she never would have thought possible. The king was gone. Only Theron remained. "I understand," she whispered. And the 2 words were enough. They were everything. They were forgiveness, acceptance, and the beginning of something new. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, a silver line in the firelight. He did not wipe it away. He simply stood there, letting her see the truth of him, the cost of his love. They stood like that for a long time, in the quiet of the firelit study, surrounded by the sleeping city and the encroaching plague. The healer and the king, 2 solitary souls who had found in each other a mirror for their own hidden scars. The pain of the past was not gone, but it was no longer a barrier between them. It was the foundation on which they would now begin to build. The air was no longer thick with unspoken words, but with a quiet, resonant peace. She did not remove her hand, and he did not move away. In that shared stillness, a different kind of healing began, one that had nothing to do with herbs and fevers, and everything to do with the slow, courageous mending of 2 fractured hearts. They began to talk, their voices low in the quiet of the study. The centuries of his life, the 15 years of hers, they unspooled them for each other, weaving them into a single, shared tapestry. He spoke of the crushing weight of his crown, of the political machinations of the Elder Council, a body of ancient, stagnant vampires who valued tradition above all else, especially a tradition like the Covenant that solidified their power over mortals. He confessed that he had ascended to the throne with a reformer's zeal, hoping to drag his stagnant court into a more enlightened age, only to find himself ensnared in a web of laws and alliances, centuries in the making. To challenge the Covenant was to challenge the very bedrock of their society. A move that would have plunged the kingdom into a bloody civil war. He could not be certain of winning. Celeste, in turn, spoke of her life in Stillwater. She told him of Elspeth, of learning the names of the wild herbs, of the simple, profound satisfaction of setting a bone or easing a fever. She described the woman she had become, a person defined not by her lineage or her place at court, but by her own 2 hands and the knowledge in her head. As he listened, Theron's expression softened, a deep respect dawning in his eyes. He had thrown her from the castle walls to save her from the wolves, and she had not only survived the fall, she had learned to fly. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself. By day, Celeste was the healer, organizing the palace's medical response, her quiet authority cutting through the panic. She established quarantine protocols, taught the staff about sanitation and the proper preparation of herbal remedies, and moved from sickbed to sickbed. A calm, steady presence in the midst of chaos. And by night, she would meet Theron in his study. Their time together was an oasis. They became not a king and his subject, but partners. He would listen to her reports from the infirmaries, his brow furrowed in concentration, valuing her observations as he would a general's from the field, and she would listen as he spoke of the kingdom, of the delicate balance of power he struggled to maintain. Her animosity had long since turned to empathy. Now, that empathy was blossoming into something deeper, something warmer. She saw the good man trapped beneath the cold weight of the crown. And he, in turn, saw in her not just the woman he had saved, but a queen in all but name wise, compassionate, and fiercely strong. Their bond was not one of fiery, sudden passion, but of a slow, deep, and inexorable recognition. It was a love built not on poetry and grand gestures, but on shared purpose and mutual respect. It was quieter and infinitely stronger. One night, as the plague finally began to show signs of receding, Theron unrolled a different kind of map on his table. It was not a map of the kingdom's geography, but of its power structures. Lines connected the great houses, notes detailed their allegiances, their wealth, their ancient grudges. For 15 years, he said, his voice low and intense, I have done more than just rule. I have been gathering string. He pointed to a name. Lord Valerius. His wealth comes from the southern mines, but his miners are human. They are treated poorly. They are ripe for dissent. He moved his finger to another name. Lord Cassian. His power lies in his control of the western garrisons. But his second in command is a young, ambitious vampire who believes the old ways are holding the kingdom back. He continued, moving from house to house, revealing a web of secrets, of vulnerabilities, of potential allies he had been carefully cultivating in the shadows for years. His plan to abolish the covenant was not a dream. It was a slow, patient, and intricate strategy. He had not been idle. He had been waiting, planning, preparing for the day he would be strong enough to act. I have been doing this alone, he said, finally looking up at her, his eyes burning with a fierce light. But the pieces are almost in place. The plague, it has weakened them. It has shown the cracks in their power. The time to move will be soon. Celeste looked at the map, at the complex, dangerous game he was playing, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty, where she belonged. You are not alone anymore, she said softly. A new chapter began. Their alliance was sealed. Celeste became his most trusted advisor, his secret weapon. Her network of healers, spread across the kingdom, became an invaluable source of information. They knew the moods of the people, the hardships they faced, the small injustices perpetrated by their local lords. She could gather intelligence in a way no spy master ever could. Through a quiet conversation over a cup of herbal tea, a whispered confidence from a grateful patient, she brought him a perspective he had never had, a view from the ground. She argued for better conditions for the miners, for fair wages for the city's workers, not just on moral grounds, but as a strategic move. A loyal and healthy populace, she reasoned, was a greater strength than a dozen discontented lords. He listened, and he acted. Quietly, through royal edicts on trade and labor, he began to shift the balance of power, strengthening the common people and, by extension, his own position, while subtly weakening the elders. Their love deepened with every shared secret, every late-night strategy session. It was a love forged in the crucible of their shared purpose. One evening, as they stood together on a balcony overlooking the now healing city, he took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt momentous. When this is over, he said, his voice quiet but firm. When the covenant is nothing but a dark memory in a history book, I will ask you to be my queen. Not because I saved you, and not because you have helped me, but because you are the other half of my soul, and this kingdom deserves a ruler with a healer's hands. Celeste's heart swelled. She intertwined her fingers with his, their hands fitting together perfectly. Ask me then, she replied. a soft smile on her lips. And I will say yes. The fight was far from over. The Elder Council was ancient, powerful, and would not relinquish its traditions without a struggle. There were dangers ahead, betrayals and battles yet to come. But as they stood there, their hands clasped, watching the first stars appear in the twilight sky, they were not afraid. The king and the healer, the lion and the dove. He had once destroyed her world to save her. Now, together, they would build a new one. Their shared past was a testament to the terrible price of love. But their shared future would be a testament to its power to transform, to heal, and to set a nation free. The story of their victory was not yet written, but in that quiet moment, they both knew with absolute certainty how it would begin.